Well, thank you for coming out tonight. This is another in our ongoing speaker series. My name is Lou Garapolo, Chair of the Historic Preservation Commission, and we're pleased to have John H. Waters, AIA, Preservation Program Director for the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, speaking tonight. So, John?
Thanks, Lou. I want to thank Atifa for inviting me and for actually reaching out. We as people in her role have changed. We've tried to keep in touch with the village because obviously this is ground zero in so many ways for Frank Lloyd Wright. So I really appreciated her reaching out and making a connection with us. So want to foster that. So saving Wright from Oak Park to Tokyo. We are we're a worldwide organization, so to speak, which is really just the United States, 1 building in Canada and 4 buildings in Japan. As you can see, nearly 400 extant buildings, and I always use qualifiers when I give numbers on Frank Lloyd Wright because there are varying ways of counting his work. For instance, the Coonley Estate in Riverside, is that one design for one estate? Is that one three designs for 3 buildings on the estate? Or actually, as is relevant to our work, it's 4, because at a certain point in time, the main house was divided in 2. So in terms of our advocacy and working with building stewards, those are 2 separate houses. So the numbers you'll see are rough numbers, approximate numbers. So Wright designed and built approximately 450. 70 of those over time have been lost through demolition or fires, natural causes, leaving about 380, or as we count them, 381 properties extant. Not surprisingly, the vast majority of those are in Illinois. About a third of them, or almost a third of them, are in Illinois, obviously, particularly around the Chicago area. Wisconsin, his native state, comes in second, again, not terribly surprisingly. As a native Michigander, I'm proud to say that Michigan is 3rd on the list. And then actually California, and then New York. Arizona, Wright's other home state, comes down a couple more beyond that. But I'm going to focus mostly to start out with on Oak Park, River Forest, with another relevant property in the Austin section of Chicago, being kind of the core right in this area here. So there have been 3 structures that have been lost in Oak Park, which, given how many were built here, is actually not too bad. One was commercial shop, the Peoples and Balch shop, and there is, as you probably know, a Balch house in Oak Park that's still very much standing. The Scoville Fountain, which is over in Scoville Park, is actually a recreation of the original, slightly moved from its original location. Whether you consider that original or not is sort of a cocktail party activity. And then River Forest. River Forest had some significant buildings. One, a really interesting Prairie period commercial building that was at the corner of Lake and Harlem, the Cummings real estate office. There was an estate for Edward Waller, who was a very important client of Wright's. Waller was his client for the renovations of the Rookery down in the Loop, for the Waller Apartments on the west side of Chicago that I'll talk a little bit about, as well as significant alterations to his own home, which was across from where the Winslow House stands now, and the Waller Gates that are on Lake Street are a remnant of that.
Why did 4 of those 5 last a very short period of time and were divorced? If you know.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics, but Cummings was a commercial building, kind of like Peebles and Balch. And particularly early on, and this is in general, most of the buildings that have been lost of Wright's were lost relatively early on. You can imagine as he became more the great man, there was more pushback on that. But and also the River Forest Golf Club, which was a really very significant design. I don't know the specifics on why that was lost, but it was a really interesting, important early design of Wright's. So the home and studio. The home and studio is so important in so many ways, both in terms of Wright's work and where he lived, but also in the preservation movement of Wright's work, the anchoring that the trust became early on in the 70s for Oak Park and the greater effort to preserve Wright's work. A lot of that developed out of the preservation work that was done on the home and studio. So just a quick look at the buildings that we have here. These early buildings are all really fascinating in their own way. Early work by a great artist can be really interesting to look at in terms of seeing him trying different things. The verticality that you see on so many of these early buildings, not what he became famous for, a decade later, and yet there's also a quality of elemental geometry that you can see in these buildings where he's moving away from the highly eclectic work that's being done at the same time, and yet still it's in there. The Moore House over here is a bit of an outlier in the sense that what you're seeing there is actually a 1920s design by Wright, as opposed to the early, much closer to the Tudor that you see that survived in the stable that was adjacent to it. There was, as you probably know, a massive fire in the house in the 1920s, and Wright came back. He was in the midst of his work in California, looking at Mayan work and other what authors have referred to as his interest in primitivism, and that really can be seen in the renovations that he did on the Moore House. Then later we're coming into what has been referred to as Wright's first golden age, and that certainly is centered particularly on Forest Avenue here in Oak Park, but around much of Oak Park. Even in some of these early buildings, you still see the verticality that we saw in the earlier ones, but he's definitely moving toward what we think of as the classic prairie buildings that you see in the Thomas House, the Hertley House, the Cheney House. And then, of course, Unity Temple, which I'll talk a little more about Unity Temple's place in the World Heritage listing that it is now a part of, all the way up to 1912 with the Adams House. And then River Forest, the so important, the William Winslow House, really Wright's first sort of masterwork, independent from Adler and Sullivan, where he had been working. The Waller Gates that I talked a little bit about earlier, his house for Isabel Roberts, all these are Ingalls House, very, very much of the Prairie School idiom, so to speak. So to talk about the preservation of these buildings, the buildings in Oak Park are, of course, all present in the two districts that, the two historic districts. I'm not going to, you know all this stuff, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about the process. Suffice it to say that these districts and your role in review of these buildings as alterations may be proposed is a critical component in the effort to preserve these buildings. There are additional individual landmarks, but those are all within the districts as well, individual landmarks. Similarly, in River Forest, though not quite to the same level of strength, all of the Wright buildings in River Forest are within the River Forest Historic District. They are all considered significant properties. That does not protect them in the same way that they're protected here in Oak Park, but they do, if alterations are proposed for these buildings, there is a mandatory meeting with the Historic Preservation Commission there. That's all that's mandatory, though. It's an opportunity for the commission to advise, dialogue with the owners, and advocate for the buildings if necessary. Then, on top of the historic districts and local landmarkings that you all work with, the Building Conservancy holds preservation easements. Just briefly, a preservation easement, though you're probably familiar, is basically where an owner donates the rights to oversee a building, is how I sort of say it in layman's terms, to a qualified organization like us, Landmarks Illinois. Similarly, Landmarks Illinois holds a preservation easement on Unity Temple. Basically, alterations, the organization that holds the easement, Landmarks Illinois or us, we have the responsibility to monitor these buildings regularly, make sure that they continue to be in good shape. If any alterations are proposed, the easements don't specifically preclude alteration, but the alteration has to be approved by the organization that holds the easement, which any organization that's going to do that is going to be loath is going to look very carefully at any sort of alterations. If there are things such as accessibility issues or things like that, those are things that can be worked within the easement, hopefully to everyone's satisfaction. So these buildings aren't set in amber specifically, but it's a powerful monitoring process for these buildings. We consider it the most powerful monitoring process.
These houses are individually owned, with easements?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. This house is actually owned by a member of our staff. So I know exactly where to find him. And actually, I met him first on an easement monitoring visit, and then when the position opened up, he He was aware of our organization, so to speak. And they can have different levels or coverage levels. For instance, the Davenport house in River Forest, it's complete exterior coverage, whereas the Copeland house, it's strictly what you see from the street. Now, you see most of the house from the street, but for varying reasons, these were slightly tailored when the easement was donated originally. And then there's also, back in the 90s, the 1990s in particular, and which is not to say that it still doesn't occur, but there was a lot of selling art glass, light fixtures, built-in furniture out of these buildings. So we developed a program whereby an owner could technically donate, say, a window to us. So we are technically the owners of windows or light fixtures in all of these buildings. It became a little dicey in terms of what the IRS thought of that, because you would be donating something and continue to have use of it. Now, you weren't able to sell it, but we don't really do that anymore the way we did. We try to encourage people to donate easements, which are a much clearer understanding of what the coverage of the agreement is. But nonetheless, I have regular monitoring visits with these owners to inspect the fixtures, furniture, whatever it might be in these buildings. So this is a good time to kind of talk about your question in terms of Conservancy, trust, foundation. The foundation was something, the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation was started by Wright. At that time, it was a way to avoid bankruptcy, but it remained as the organization that both stewards, Taliesin in Wisconsin and Taliesin West in Arizona, it also retains the intellectual property rights for his work. And it also, until 10 years or so ago, held the Frank Lloyd Wright Archive. That archive is now at the Avery Library at Columbia University. But there still is, for those of us that use the materials, that are, there's an interesting arrangement between the Avery and the Foundation, where now the great thing is you have to get permission from 2 different organizations if you're going to use documents from these. But we try to keep a collegial relationship with both organizations, and that helps that. So that's the foundation. The trust, as you know, was created to save and restore the Frank Lloyd Wright home and studio in the 70s, and has done an amazing job at stewarding the home and studio, Roby House, and other things that it's done through the years. In the late 1990s, there were a series of get-togethers, conferences, whatever you want to call them, that involved stewards, building stewards, both private homeowners and public site stewards, academics, and just enthusiasts. And somebody's like, we should start an organization that is independent from the organizations that are tied specifically with sites. and is about the preservation of all of Wright's work. And that's where the building Conservancy started in 1989, 1990. I keep forgetting which year we were incorporated and which, but it was right around that time. And so, interestingly enough, one of the things that we do is we have the Big Wright Conference, not the foundation, and the reason for that is basically we grew out of this kind of ad hoc conference that was occurring regularly previous to that. So that's a central part of what we do. This is sort of the three-legged stool of our services. Advocacy, I'll talk a little bit about. Education in terms of the conference. We have a magazine that we do that comes out twice a year. And then technical services, which is sort of my main bailiwick as an architect working directly with building stewards. One of the major efforts that our organization has done was to shepherd the UNESCO World Heritage inscription of 8 of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings. 2 of those in the Chicago area, Unity Temple, Roby House, but they're really all over the country. You can see here, Unity Temple, Roby House, Taliesin, Hollyhock in Los Angeles, Falling Water, the Jacobs House up in Madison, Taliesin West, and the Guggenheim. And here's a map showing, I mean, they do span the continent. And that was one of those projects that if you knew what you were getting into when you started, we never would have done it, which was a good thing we didn't know. It was a National Register, National Historic Landmark nomination on steroids. And it took about 15 plus years and more than one review to accomplish that. But that was a major accomplishment. And the goal of that was not just to recognize the specific buildings, but to recognize Wright and his work in general as worthy of the highest level of cultural designation. And you may remember there was a proposal to build a very tall building on Lake Street, directly across from Scoville Park. And among other things, what really turned out to be the most powerful argument was that it was going to cast shadows on this building, Unity Temple, which was just about primed to become a World Heritage Site. And it was very interesting how powerful that argument was. It was kind of gratifying that effort led to something that I think was much more reasonable for that site than a tower like that. Other efforts in Oak Park, the George and Lucy Smith House. This house, you may have been aware, was a bit of a sleeping beauty for decades. It was not in good shape. At one point in time, the village had to step in and demand that certain improvements be made to the house in order for it to be habitable. One family hadn't owned it for about 50 years. No one had ever been in it. It was very much an unknown house, and yet a very intriguing house in it. So I was talking about the sort of elemental geometry of some of these early houses, and this is 1898. So this is a very early Wright work. In December of 2022, we got word that this was going on the market, and my colleague Barb Gordon, our executive director, and I, along with one of our board members, one of our board members from Buffalo who said, if you're getting in the Smith house, I'm coming right now. And he got in his car and drove over. And we documented the house. Pat, the board member, and I, who's also an architect, did measurements of the house. There were no drawings of this house. There were no drawings in the archive. One small little thumbnail of the house had been published, thumbnail plan of the house. So it was a very unknown house. So over Christmas, because this is what I like to do over Christmas, I did a SketchUp model of the house that at least started to give some idea of what the house could look like. You can see up in the upper right, it was kind of derelict at that point in time, including drawings, which we promptly, right after New Year's, put up on our website for people to reference as they were considering the house. You can see broken art glass, that sort of thing. This is what it is now. And the owners, the owners are very generous in their stating that the efforts that we went to publicize the house, the drawings that I did were very helpful in, as reference, encouraging them to take this on, and they've done an amazing job in the last 2 years bringing it back to life. And it's on Home Avenue.
Okay.
Yeah.
They opened up to
Yes.
the public and owners.
Yeah. So it's going to be on Right Plus this year.
Yeah.
They hosted our members' holiday party. It's really, I mean, it's not like a museum restoration. They brought it back to life. That's really the point of what they did to us, because it had been, had gone dormant for a lot of years. So I'm very excited about that. So over in Austin on Central Avenue, this is one of our major advocacy efforts right now. This is a house that the more I learn about the house, the more important this house appears in Wright's work for me. It's a relatively small house from 1903, but it is a house that has all of the components of Wright's mature prairie work. And the fact that it is a relatively small house is important in the trajectory of Wright's work. He had been doing large houses, relatively large houses like on Forest Streets, even mansion-sized houses like the Willits House up in Highland Park. This is a distillation of his work to a smaller scale, and that would become important as Wright does things like the American System-built homes, which was a pre-cut process that he worked on in the 19 teens, and then ultimately the Usonians later on in his life. So this house was also owned by one family for about 50 years. As opposed to the house on Home Avenue, I would contend, although the house went through some real issues in terms of deferred maintenance over the last couple decades, if that family hadn't provided the stability for 50 years in that neighborhood, it's very likely that that house wouldn't be there. So as the owner, Mrs. Teague, who had the house, died in 2019 at nearly 100. Before her death, we were trying to work with the family to find ways to help work on this house. It's very, because we work with so many private homeowners as opposed to for income generating properties like many of us do. Financial support for private homeowners is very difficult. If you live in Oak Park, where the taxes are higher than other places, like Austin, there is motivation to take advantage of the state's great tax freeze for private homeowners. And people do in Oak Park, and that's great. Taxes are not as high in Austin, and if you're a nearly 100-year-old woman living in a house in Austin, that one form of support is not viable. So it was hard to see that as she was living in this house. At a certain point in time, she took out a reverse mortgage on the house in the late 90s. That has now put the house in foreclosure to the tune of well over $500,000, which is just not what this house is going to capture on the market. So we are working with the courts, we are working with our partners, Landmarks Illinois and Preservation Chicago, on this house. We attended a court hearing earlier this month. So this is, we're also specifically working with Austin Coming Together, the community group in Austin, who are very interested in this house and potentially, I don't know if I should be public about this, potentially considering taking it on. They have developed a very impressive center directly across the street from this, the Aspire Center, that's opening up almost as we speak. And that's very fortunate for this house that they are going to be based directly across the street from it. So I'm cautiously optimistic about this house, but right now it's locked in this foreclosure situation. And part of our job is to advocate to get it out of that as soon as possible into hands of an entity that will take it on and restore it. One of the things we've done on a relatively small scale, but important, the Building Conservancy just went ahead and had the landscape cleaned up so that it would be more secure and look less vulnerable. We've had some particularly problematic spaces just covered so that rain won't be pouring into the house. And then we have Price Tower in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. This has been a major effort. We've been working a lot with lawyers lately. And this is a building that was considered for UNESCO World Heritage List. For various reasons it didn't go through, but at the time it was being considered, we took on a preservation easement on the building. It's a tough building to have in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, which is about 50 minutes north of Tulsa, but a world away. And it, for many years, was there was a Price Tower Arts Center, which stewarded it, and also ran a hotel in the building. They had an angel, former head of Phillips Petroleum, who was pumping money into that organization, and then he died. And his heirs said, he gave you enough money. And then for about 10 years, it seriously struggled. It was sold 2 years ago to someone who was problematic. And we eventually had to go to court with this person. That entity has now gone into bankruptcy, which is actually a good thing for the building. I'm going to be going down next week to assess the condition of the building, but it's one of our major concerns. I'm not certain what we're going to find at Harold Price's office next week when we go down. That's it. those pictures are from when I was there in 2022, but just not certain. And it's made a lot of news, starting with this reporter in Bartlesville who kind of blew the whistle on the activity of selling items out of the building. So that's been a time-consuming activity, but it's what we're here for. It's why we have these easements. Ultimately, the vast majority of our easement of people, entities on which we hold easements are amazing stewards, but we're here for the ones that aren't. So you can find more information on this on our website. And from Bartlesville, Oklahoma to Tokyo, Japan, there are 4 Wright buildings in Japan. One is the reconstructed lobby of his Imperial Hotel, which might be my nomination for Wright's most amazing work, which was unfortunately demolished in 1968. There is a school that survived in Tokyo and is now a public site. There is a house near south of Tokyo that's also a public site. Then there's this house, the Hayashi House in Tokyo, which again is another one of these buildings that's been under wraps for decades. I was in Tokyo last fall, met with the people from the Setagaya ward, which is the ward that Tokyo being so big, its wards are basically cities within the city. And people in that office are very engaged with trying to advocate for this building with the owner of the property that it is a part of, which is Sumitomo Bank. And Sumitomo Bank is a major organization in Japan, and so among the things we have been doing is we have been working with the ward office, writing letters as appropriate to, and visiting when we are able to keep it apparent that the world is watching, so to speak, and that this is something that should be promoted, should be protected. I was not. Sorry?
Where's the Hayashi?
It's up here. At the. There we go. That's as close as I could get to it. I had to walk all the way around the block. Was not accessible. So what do I do when I, can't see a building or get to it? I build a model of it. From Legos to SketchUp, it's a short jump. But this is basically images of. I actually have those sort of reversed. Images of how we believe it was originally, and then there's been some significant changes, but this key portion here, which is the living room, it's our understanding that remains fairly intact. This is Barb, my boss, who was in Japan 2 years ago meeting with the ward, and I was there last fall. So again, we're trying to keep this presence of international interest going on the house. Then here's a success story after some challenge. The Waller Apartments on the west side of Chicago. This was a set of low-income, specifically not designed as low-income housing in the 1890s. You can see Unity Temple, Walser House, Waller Apartments. This is as it was in 1966. Francisco Terrace, which was over here, was demolished in 1972. There was a fire in these buildings. So we're left with the buildings there on the right. probably know Francisco Terrace because of the remnants that were, the fragments that were repurposed for this building on Lake Street. But one of the units was on the market. It had been badly neglected by its owner. The owner, it seemed, was motivated to sell, but when push came to shove, didn't seem to want to take any offers that were being given for this building. Plus, he had a huge water bill because there had been a leaking, like tens of thousands of dollars water bill. So we were very concerned about this, not just for the building itself, but for the units on either side. It was becoming structurally really problematic. So again, none of these things are done by one group individually. It's all about partnerships. That's why I'm so glad to be here. In this situation, Landmarks Illinois brought in with Jenny Elsner to do a structural survey of the building. Preservation Chicago identified a potential buyer. The potential buyer was willing to make an offer, but it was very hard to get the owner to the table. And so Barb Gordon, my executive director, spent hours on the phone brokering, holding hands, brokering this situation. So this statement by the realtor about all the work that we put into getting this sale successfully to happen is important to me because it shows how much happens behind the scenes that nobody knows about in these preservation efforts. And I think we all probably have experienced that. It's not always the chaining yourself, to the building so that it won't be bulldozed that's really publicly knowledgeable, publicly apparent. It's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes. So, to talk a little more about the other things we do, technical services. I work with building stewards all over the country. I've been on a lot of Wright roofs to track down leaks. Then we have our education aspect. One of the great aspects of that is our Thorpe Emerging Professionals scholarships that we have for our conference. We often have about half a dozen of these Thorpe scholars. They're students, grad students, or professionals in early years of their career, and it's named for John Thorpe, who some of you may know. He was a really very important Oak Park architect in terms of restoring Wright's work. So this is something in his honor. Our most visited page on our website is Wright on the Market. That is a place where you can go to see all Wright buildings that are currently on the market. Annually, we give out Wright Spirit Awards for private owners, public sites, and others who have really shown spirit, Wright spirit. The Goodrich House here in Oak Park 2 years ago got a Wright Spirit Award for their work on that house.
This is just 1 year?
That's just 1 year. This was this was Chicago in 2022, and we got everybody. So usually we have about 6 awards a year. And then, as I say, our annual conference in Pittsburgh coming up this year. We have it in a different site every year, where there's a critical mass of Wright's work, and it's talks, tours, and the Wright Spirit Awards as well. So I encourage anyone who's interested to take a look at our website. So, and with that, that's the building.
The flowing water house, I read that there was some major water problems or leaking problems.
It's fine. They're I think it was Philip Johnson who made a crack about leaving these artworks out in the rain. And that's always true. There's always going to be levels of work that needs to be done on these buildings, and they're going through a big effort right now. So that's something that a journalist grabbed on and spun as a negative instead of a positive. That isn't it great that they're doing this major restoration work? It was spun. It was a great way to write bash. So, but it's doing well. So, yes, sir.
What would you say to the folks in Oak Park who basically think that the only things that are landmark or preservation worthy in terms of importance are the right buildings, and dismiss everything else that sort of ran parallel to it, just not here?
Well, I came to this job being a preservation, not being a right fanatic. So I would say that that's silly. I mean, Oak Park is just so wonderful in terms of all sorts of things. I mean, all the E.B. Roberts and all the many other things in Oak Park. I mean, to me, something like, it's sort of like, the World Heritage nomination was not done to specifically focus on 8 buildings. It was to focus on Wright's work, and I think Wright's work in Oak Park can be used the same way as a way to focus on the wonderful architectural heritage in Oak Park in general. Wright is just, for better or worse, Wright is the most famous architect there is. There's ways it's better, but then when you get an article about falling water, it's like, let's throw some darts because everybody knows that name. But I would certainly encourage preservation in general. That to not preserve the context for Wright's, if you want to be Wright-centric about it, to not preserve the context for Wright's buildings the Wright's buildings lose out as well. But I think you can say it's about the individual buildings as well, so. Yes?
In your work across the country and even among other countries, what can we learn from other municipalities, states, or countries to better support our historic resources?
That's a good question. Let me think about that for a moment, because I think, as when we were looking at the Smith House and the process, that we didn't have to worry about the Smith House being torn down because we knew Oak Park was going to make sure it didn't. So that's not a luxury we have in a lot of cities. So I think I'm inclined to say it's what other cities can learn from Oak Park. But I think it's obviously being ever vigilant and thinking about some of the other cities that we've worked with. Oak Park's kind of at the top of the heap in some ways. But I'm going to think about that.
Yeah, it would be great to know about other programs that could support the people who live in the homes who want to perform renovations, because, as you said in your presentation,
It's a struggle.
there's just not a lot of support for that.
Yeah. It's a real struggle. I come up against it all the time, because it is mostly private homes that we work with. So yeah. Well, we'll keep in touch, and I can mull that over and share my thoughts with Atifa when I think about the other cities.